Our next panel is on the state of modern arson investigation, taking arson investigation from the scene to laboratory. And moderating our panel is Chris Fabricant from the Strategic Litigation section of the Innocence Project. Our panelists are John Lentini. John is one of a handful of people certified to conduct both fire scene investigations and fire debris analysis. He's conducted more than 2,000 fire scene inspections and has appeared as an expert witness on more than 200 occasions. He is an immediate past chairman of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences Criminalistic Section. He also serves on the NIST OSAC subcommittee on fire and explosion investigations. He received the Society of Fire Protection Engineers 2015 Person of the Year Award in recognition of his work in moving the fire investigation profession forward and in helping to prevent or reverse miscarriages of justice in arson cases. He is also the author of a book now in its second edition, Scientific Protocols for Fire Investigation. Also appearing on the panel with John, and I might mention parenthetically that it was a presentation that John gave at this same conference several years ago that frankly gave me the idea that it would be a good idea for us to A, bring John back, and B, re-examine where we are in fire investigation currently. Also on the panel is Mike Marquardt, Senior Special Agent and Certified Fire Investigator with the Fire and Arson Investigations Branch of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Mike has been a special agent with the Bureau since September of 1990, and he is assigned as a full-time member of ATF's National Response Team. That dedicated team is dedicated to respond and investigate large-scale fire and explosion-related incidents throughout the United States and internationally when requested by foreign governments through the U.S. State Department. He has conducted or participated in more than 422 research and training fire explosions. He's designed and instructed both basic and advanced fire scene investigation technique courses and fire dynamic courses at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center and at numerous fire investigation related conferences and seminars throughout the United States and in multiple forensic countries. He holds a certification as a certified fire investigator through the International Association of Arson Investigators. He is a member of the National Fire Protection Association and currently sits as the alternate member representing ATF at the NFPA 921 Technical Committee on Fire Investigation. I omitted one thing in introducing Chris too. I wanted to acknowledge that not only is Chris the moderator for this panel and is there at the Innocence Project in strategic litigation, but he was also a member of our planning committee for this symposium, and I want to thank him for his participation in that effort. So, Chris, it's all yours.
You're welcome. That was quite an effort. I could speak for everybody on the planning committee on that regard. So we're going to do more of like a conversational type of presentation here today, in that John and Mike are going to cover, kind of the basics of fire investigation, and then we're going to move into, when Todd comes back, toward the end of this panel, talking about DNA retrieval from fire scenes. And when we were talking about this yesterday in preparation for this presentation, it occurred to me that it might be a good place to start. What are we talking about? What is fire investigation? And maybe, Mike, since this is your slide, you could answer these questions for us. Apart from this one that's been answered.
Well, I don't know how many individuals in the audience have been exposed to any type of fire-related investigation. If you're in the law enforcement world or in the prosecutorial world, likely you hear it as an arson investigation. And we're trying to move away from that, and I will preach daily that it is a fire investigation, not an arson investigation. We are trying to determine what the origin and cause of the fire is at a particular incident. So as the slide up there depicted, we're trying to determine the origin and cause and progression of the fire. A couple of foundational issues are, what is origin and what is cause? And so I threw a few slides in last night just to touch upon those topics, basically to give you a foundation of where we're going with this panel. So in very generic terms, determine the origin. That's pretty logical, the geographic location where a fire started. And then determining the cause, basically the circumstances that brought about or resulted in the fire. Those are very generic, basic definitions. Now, I also threw in a couple slides that give the textbook definitions. So that's what you see now on the screen for origin. That would be the textbook definition from a document that we're going to discuss somewhat, maybe at length, depending on how this goes. NFPA 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation. There's a textbook definition for both area of origin and point of origin. And our goal as fire investigators is to determine those. Why would we want to do that? Because within that area of origin or at that point of origin, we will likely, hopefully, find the ignition source, which is part of the cause of the fire, if that makes sense. So we have cause. Now there's something that's pretty critical to understand about cause of a fire. It's not just the ignition source. We can have an ignition source in this room all day long, a candle burning on the table, and have a fire in this room, and the candle may not be the ignition source for that particular fire. The ignition source has to come in contact with a fuel in a form that can ignite with the energy provided by that ignition source. They have to come in contact, and that's our point of origin. But there's another serious or important element in that fire cause, and it's kind of laid out here. The determination of the cause requires the identification of those factors that were necessary for the fire to have occurred. So we can have an ignition source and we can have a first fuel, but how do they come together? What are the circumstances that brought them together? So that is one of the pieces of the puzzle that we as fire investigators are trying to determine. Okay, we found the ignition source. We found what we believed that the first fuel was. What are the circumstances that brought those together? In investigating the circumstances that brought those together, we get into some of the topic areas that we're going to discuss through this panel. What information, is it just physical evidence? Is it other evidence? Are there witness statements? Is there evidence that some may consider domain irrelevant information that is actually relevant, and who decides? what information is important to identifying the circumstances on how that first fuel and ignition source came together. I'll just add this final slide and then we'll get this moving. Cause is not it's a concept, not a thing, I would argue. That's not my statement. Again, that goes to a lot of investigators, individuals make the mistake of believing that the ignition source is the cause. Well, the ignition source is part of the cause. Yes, we have to also identify the first fuel and the circumstances that brought them together.
So, John, perhaps you can answer this question as a kind of a more fundamental issue that I think is lost in a lot of, certainly, lawyers. And there are really two fields associated with, broadly speaking, fire investigation. Could you talk about those two different fields and what they entail?
Yeah, there's fire debris analysis is generally practiced in crime laboratories by people with chemical training, chemical degrees, and they are looking at physical evidence that fire investigators collect from the field. The fire investigators out in the field may not have the first clue about the laboratory analysis other than the chemist says, bring me a can of debris and I'll tell you if there's gasoline or any ignitable liquid in the can. So it's two completely different disciplines. And most of the people that are doing the chemical analysis of fire debris don't have a clue what the fire investigator does when he's out on the scene. I'm one of the people, I started as a chemist in the Georgia Crime Laboratory and got invited by the fire marshals to come out to fire scenes to help them locate where the bad guy had poured the gasoline. And so through that experience and subsequent training, I learned to do both of them. But there are very few people that do the chemical analysis that know anything at all about reading fire patterns or fire dynamics. And it's kind of a shame, but that's just the way the system is set up. So it's really two different disciplines and two different ways to get certified.
And is this distinction reflected in the OSAC structure?
It is. We have in the OSAC, we have a fire and explosion scene subcommittee, and we have a fire debris analysis subcommittee. Two different groups of people. The fire debris analysis people are working on putting some of the pretty well settled ASTM standards onto the registry, and the fire scene people have just proposed NFPA 921, Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations, as a guide, and NFPA 1033, Standard for Professional Qualifications for Fire Investigators, as a standard. And those are going to be up for public comment soon. Maybe now? Soon? June 15? Okay. So the 1033 standard is only about a dozen pages of actual words, whereas the 921 standard is close to 400 pages. And it'll certainly be interesting to see what the other parts of the OSAC and what the public think about these standards, both of which have been out for a very long time.
So just can I get a show of hands how many people are familiar with the OSACs? And do we need to define this? It feels like about half. Just so quickly, it's the Organization of Scientific Area Committees. That's a joint project. It's really controlled by NIST. That it used to be all the SWIGs were scientific working groups that are associated with various disciplines. They were disaggregated around the country. Some of them were very scientific, some of them were less so. The OSAC structure has brought all these techniques together and created kind of one superstructure, another brilliant federal bureaucracy, but it's, the effort is to nationalize guidelines and standards for various techniques. Standards, just for those, because I've also heard this word being used a lot, the difference between a standard and a guideline is a standard is mandatory and a guideline is not. So what John and Mike are talking about is that the OSAC structures are now trying to develop standards that will be used and listed on NIST National Registry of Standards. Right now, there's only one that's actually been listed on this registry, but it appears that there'll be more forthcoming. So just before we leave the OSAC structure, could you talk about the backgrounds of the fire investigators that make up that OSAC? What are their typical educational backgrounds? Mike, I think you're on that.
I'm actually not on that committee. John is. We do have 4 or 5 special agents with ATF, certified fire investigators with ATF, who are on that committee. But other members, John, you could probably speak more to that.
The committee is chaired by Dr. Craig Byler, who is a fire protection engineer. I sat through his qualifications one time in a trial and came away very impressed. He's got 4 or 5 degrees. And one of the smartest people I know. They got lucky getting Craig to accept that chairmanship. There's law enforcement officers. We have a statistician who is from the University of Alabama, and when he heard us talking about the uncertainties associated with fire investigation at our first meeting, he was shocked and appalled. We also have some people that are into explosions, explosive dynamics, but it's mostly fire investigators. I'm the token chemist on the fire scene investigation committee. Then there is a separate committee that is composed entirely of chemists, and anybody in fire chemistry, fire debris analysis is in that room working on the standards. They are having a difficult time, I think, in coming to consensus. They want the standard to be perfect before it goes on the registry. And as someone who's been involved in standards development since the early 90s, there's no such a thing. There are good standards. Perfect standards are the enemy of good standards. And so that's why it's a little slow at the moment. My view of, when you're designing a best practice, get it down on paper, get the consensus that you have, and then take it out and use it and see how it works. It's just like with a car. You can't tell how a car is going to perform until you take it out and drive it. And I think this is my view of how standards ought to be worked and how they ought to be improved. If you wait until you've got a standard that satisfies everybody in the OSAC, you're going to be waiting a long time, particularly when you consider the comments of the Legal Resource Committee, which is a whole bunch of lawyers, and it just drive you nuts. And my comment to these lawyers, mainly when they comment on the validity of a standard, is, where were you when we were writing these standards? Why were you not in the room writing these standards? ASTM has been working for well over 25 years, full-time, meeting at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences every year, and we look around and we see practitioners. We don't see lawyers. We don't see judges. And so it is a little annoying when they decide to comment on the standards, haven't been given the opportunity to participate in the development. They just wait until it's done, and then they say, oh, this is wrong. So
okay, how to adjust the standards. Does it make maybe some of the other lawyers in the room a little bit uncomfortable about test driving a standard, when we're talking about life and liberty issues?
We've been driving these standards for 25 years.
Right, but because the standard is old doesn't necessarily mean it's valid.
No, I absolutely understand that. But the fire debris standards, they've been validated through proficiency testing for a lot of years.
Okay.
And I get your concern that we don't want to be testing out new stuff on innocent defendants, or guilty defendants for that matter. But we have to have standards, and having a standard is better than not having a standard. And if those are the choices, give me a standard any day, and we can improve on that, and we will appreciate the input from the legal community the next time we revise the standard. But don't be telling us that we did it wrong, for the last 25 years.
That's our job. So Let's think of, speaking of old science, as you know, as Mr. Lentini is well known and has participated in the exonerations of numerous individuals that were wrongfully convicted based on the old science, and I know that Mike too has been involved in some of these cases. Could you, John and Mike, describe what the old science was, what was wrong with it, and how we got to NFPA 921?
I'll go first. Basically, you can categorize the old science as myths and legends. Myths and legends that were developed over years of anecdotal, non-scientific fire scene investigation and training. And when I started in the mid-90s, we should have been well beyond that, but we weren't. And I was taught some of the myths and legends. Again, they developed because fire investigators in the trade, you know, they saw things. They saw things in fire scenes, they saw things in training fires that to them logically made sense, but then none of that was validated, or little of it was validated through science. And through the apprenticeship and training of new fire investigators, those myths and legends were passed down. And then over the years, well, beginning in 1992, NFPA 921 came out with the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations to try to develop a guide. And we've been talking about standards and guides. This is a guide designed and intended to improve the fire investigation. And it evolved and has evolved over the years. And both John and I are on the committee that develop and evolve that textbook, that guide, every 3 years. A new edition comes out. So the old science, the old myths and legends, again, you know, you see spalled concrete, you see annealed springs, you see crazed glass. That meant in the old days that there had to have been ignitable liquid used, because frankly what I saw in my initial training was we trained investigators not as fire investigators but as arson investigators. So how do you train an arson investigator? Well, you show them what arson looks like, right? Well, if you show them what arson looks like over and over and over again, they're just going to be looking for what arson looks like and not fire investigation. And so if you set, and I've been involved in setting over 400 training and research fires of structures and vehicles, and if you do that every time using ignitable liquid, you're going to develop a frame of reference to look for patterns and damage that looks like that. But what we have evolved and continue to evolve with research over the last 10 to 15 years is we're actually doing training and research fires on accidental causes. And we've discovered, you know what, accidental caused fires can create some of those very same patterns that we saw developed out of intentionally set fires. So, and where I believe we've truly advanced is in our understanding of fire dynamics and fire behavior, especially as it relates to compartment fires, which is, a compartment is a room in a house or in a building. I don't know if I've wandered on too far off the topic, but I'll stop myself there.
Well, I agree with the contention that it wasn't science back then. I used to call it witchcraft. And when I learned it in the 70s, so I learned even more myths and legends than Mike did, and had to unlearn them, which I did by applying science. And the problem that I had was people told me, go back to the laboratory, John, you're upsetting the apple cart here. Because people would tell me that crazed glass meant rapid heating. I said, I don't think so. And I can test that, I know how to test that. And in 1991, there was this tragic fire in Oakland, California that took out 3,000 houses. It killed 26 people, including some firefighters. Multi-billion-dollar tragedy. As a forensic scientist, I saw that as what an opportunity. And took 2 colleagues out there, and we went around to 50 houses. We had planned to go to 100, but when we got to 50, we had pretty uniform results. And we found evidence of arson in 50 out of 50 of these fires that were known to be accidents. And we wrote that up, and I was kind of considered the spawn of Satan for a while, because I had taken away all of the tools that fire investigators had been using. And when you use crazed glass or spalled concrete as a basis for your arson determination and send somebody to prison for life on that basis, you're not going to want to accept that maybe that wasn't good stuff. You're going to be in denial. And when NFPA 921 came out in 1992, the collective heads of the fire investigation profession exploded. They wanted nothing to do with that standard. They said, what do you mean we have misconceptions about the meaning of these artifacts? Who are you to tell me how to do my job? And it was a full 8 years, 3 editions before the International Association of Arson Investigators decided to endorse the document. So there was a great resistance to standardization or any kind of change in fire investigation throughout the 90s. And we had wars over, including the word science in the document. They wanted us to take it out. We had proposals to say, call it a systematic method. Don't use science, because most fire investigators are not scientists. They used to be firemen. And I have great admiration for anyone that will run into a burning building, because if the fire alarm goes off, I'm leaving. Those guys run into a burning building, but extinguishing fires and determining the origin and cause are 2 completely different skill sets. And these guys didn't have the basic education to understand their training. So you can train people all day long. If they don't have some fundamental education, they're not going to understand it. They'll kind of parrot it back. But 921 has succeeded so far in persuading people that, yes, the floor can burn. Yes, the floor can have an irregular pattern that looks like that pattern you saw in the training fire caused by gasoline. But yes, accidental fires and intentionally set fires look a lot alike, particularly if they burn for any length of time. And this is something that was generally accepted, or gradually accepted over the 1990s. Now what we've got to do, and the current challenge, is to persuade fire investigators that origin determination is not so easy. They think it's easy, and they talk about a V-shaped burn pattern moving up and out, and you get to the point of the V, and by God, there's your origin. Well, that works really well if you put the fire out within the first 2 or 3 minutes of its existence before it becomes fully involved. And a lot of people didn't understand that. A lot of people still don't accept it. They think that they can go into a fully involved room that burned for 10 or 15 minutes and tell you exactly where the fire started. Those people have more talent than I do. No, that's where we're at with 921 today.
So you've both touched on it a little bit, but just to make it clear for the audience, is that if you're getting a arson conclusion, what are some of the indicators that attorneys should be looking for that would show that perhaps this arson or fire investigator is relying on the myths? What is it? I mean, you mentioned spalling of concrete, crazed glass. What are those? What did they rely on previously?
Most of the myths and legend, I believe you could list probably 10 to 12, were all based in the idea that only an ignitable liquid could cause that type of pattern to develop. So when we're talking about spalling of concrete, that's the chipping of the concrete when it breaks up. When we're talking about crazing of glass, that's the cracking of the glass. Annealing of springs, that's when steel loses its tensile strength. So the springs will collapse on a bed. What were some of the other ones?
Like alligator?
Shiny alligators.
Shiny alligatoring, like that has to be created by an ignitable liquid. All of those patterns were based in that foundational idea that it could be created by ignitable liquid. So in today's world, if we suspect an ignitable liquid is present and caused the damage, particularly in a compartment fire that has gone beyond flashover into post-flashover, basically the entire room has been involved in fire, visual observation of patterns and identification of an ignitable liquid are not acceptable. You have to take samples and have fire debris analysis and confirmation that ignitable liquid is present. That's today's world. So if you have an investigator coming to you and he's showing you photographs, he or she, of a compartment that is obviously burned floor to ceiling, wall to wall, and he or she is identifying an ignitable liquid pour pattern, and he or she has no samples to back that up, you better step back and ask some more questions. Doesn't mean they're absolutely wrong, but there likely are problems right there. I mean, that would be a clue.
So one of the other things that I understand to be have been debunked have been multiple points of origin, and that was more thought of as indicative of arson before the understanding of full room involvement and flashover became a known phenomenon. Could you describe both that prior myth and the way I understand it as being kind of a sea change when they understood full room involvement? John?
Multiple points of origin are an indicator of arson. There's no question about it. An accidental fire, except in the rarest of circumstances, is going to start in one place, and it's going to burn from there and spread. So if you have that, you got an arson case. The problem comes when the investigator sees multiple points of origin in the same room, and that room has become fully involved. And the investigator says, well, I have low charring, floor level charring on the east side of the room and floor level charring on the west side of the room, and the floor is relatively undamaged. In the middle, it's black. It's been fully involved. If the burning is contiguous, it's not valid to say there are multiple points of origin. It's just not. You can't do it unless you've got a videotape of the fire starting in two places at once, or unless a fireman goes into the room and he's in the middle of the room and he sees fire on the left and fire on the right. There are ways to prove that, but looking at fire patterns after a fire has burned for more than a few minutes in a fully involved condition, you can't do it. You have to consider the entire room as your area of origin. And then you have to consider every potential ignition source in that room. And for years and years, and continuing till today, there are investigators that will say, well, I know the fire started in the living room. It started at the east side of the living room. The television and entertainment center is on the west side of the living room. Therefore, I can eliminate them because they are outside the point of origin. If you see that in a report, you need to get a second opinion. And that's what I suggest in any case where you, as a lawyer, if you're presented with this case, either as an insurance defense lawyer or as a prosecutor, and you don't feel that looking at the evidence, you can see multiple points of origin, you should get a second opinion. It costs a little money, but not nearly as much as paying some poor son of a bitch that did 35 years in prison for setting a fire that wasn't really a set fire. So you just need to balance the cost there. And paying for a wrongful conviction is a lot more expensive than consulting with another expert. And a lot of times, people from Mike's agency, I'm sure he doesn't want to get called that many times, but they will be available to consult. And a CFI from the ATF, I've had my disagreements with them over the years, but generally, if it was an ATF CFI that's making the call, I'm a little more comfortable. And yeah, generally, 2 out of 3 times when I look at somebody's case, a lot of times the lawyers are just doing due diligence. I look at it and I say, you know what, this really is an arson fire. It's the 1 out of 3 times that it needs a little more scrutiny. So it doesn't hurt to get a second opinion.
I'll just piggyback on that. At least at a minimum, ask some tough questions up front, get some clarification. If it's not obvious to you, I mean, you have logic, common sense, a little bit of training. Ask some tough questions up front. Getting another opinion, not a bad idea. And I get calls from prosecutors and other investigative agencies all the time. I didn't go to those scenes. I didn't work the scene. And on my fires, I ask and look for objective review of my work. That's something I think we may wander into on this panel discussion. I may be going there too soon, but a technical or peer review is a good idea. And especially early on, when that case is presented to you as the attorney who may be handling that case, ask some really tough questions and ferret out that information up front. It's a lot better doing that then than when you're in an evidentiary hearing or a Daubert hearing and you're realizing your witness may be not such an expert after all. And you're already invested a lot of time, money into that case. It's hard to walk away from those cases at that point.
Well, we're going to, I think, do a little bit more on expert vetting in a minute, but you touched on the old science we kind of understand, and we know that NFPA 921 is new. What's the difference? What do we understand today that we didn't before?
You know, I just thought of another one that I really want to throw out there because it's used a lot. You see it on TV a lot. If you hear an investigator saying that was a hot, fast fire, had to be arson, I mean, that's a dead ringer. You better step back and ask some hard questions. Every fire is a hot, fast fire. It is. Whether there's ignitable liquids there or not. The materials, the products, the everyday furniture that we Americans and around the world, the products that are made and used every day are hydrocarbon-based products. Plastics, they burn hot and fast. So that leads into what's different now than in the past. In the past, we had more cotton-based and wool-based fabrics and furniture. And now we have polystyrene, polyurethane, nylon. Those products burn differently than they burned 20, 30 years ago. And as a result, the behavior of the fire is dramatically different. And so we are trying to comprehend, understand those changes through research. And we're documenting the changes in fire behavior and the dynamics of fire as a result of differences in products. I mean, that's just one very complex, but one very direct difference between what was then and what is now.
Yeah, and this is one of the big problems with fire investigation. This has always bothered me, is that fire investigators would say, well, this fire burned hotter than normal, therefore it must have had a special kind of fuel, a liquid accelerant. Well, people have known for millennia that if you want to make a fire hotter, you don't change the fuel. You blow on it. It's all about the ventilation. And so if you see this in a fire report, that this fire burned hotter than normal, or that the aluminum threshold melted, and that's the basis for their determination that this fire was intentionally set, they're wrong. You can ask them all the tough questions you want. It might have been an intentionally set fire, but not because the aluminum threshold melted. Aluminum thresholds melt in ordinary fires every single day. We have tried to tell people this. The first edition of 921 said wood and gasoline burn at essentially the same flame temperature. The gasoline burns faster, but it doesn't burn any hotter. We said that in every single edition of NFPA 921 that's been out there, and there are still fire investigators that think that an accelerated fire is going to burn at a higher temperature than an unaccelerated fire. One of my first experiences in test fires, I went to this weekend seminar. We had a house we were allowed to burn down, and we filled one room with crumpled up newspaper, and the other room we poured gasoline all around. And I brought one of my scientific instruments out. I brought a device that could handle multiple thermocouples, temperature measuring devices, and put them in the rooms and ran the thermocouple wire out. And the newspaper room was burning hotter at a higher temperature than the gasoline room. And my colleagues out there accused me of switching them up. He said, you must have got them backwards. And I traced it. I said, no, sorry. And, I've since been on Anderson Cooper's show, burning a wood crib on one side and a pool of gasoline on the other side. The wood burns hotter on that particular experiment. It's all the same. It depends on the amount of air. And it's just taken fire investigators forever to get that, mainly because they lack fundamental scientific training.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Well,